For centuries, we believed the Vikings of Greenland simply vanished without a trace. But new DNA evidence reveals a shocking truth. They never actually left. What really happened was far more complex and far more connected to the Arctic world than anyone realized. This is the story of an entire civilization hidden by history, waiting for science to unlock its secrets. The Norse settlements of Greenland have puzzled historians and archaeologists for nearly 600 years. Around 985 CE, a Viking explorer named Eric the Red, fleeing Iceland after being exiled for murder, established the first permanent European settlements on this massive icebound island. For approximately 5 centuries, these isolated communities not only survived, but thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They built elaborate churches that still stand today as stone monuments to medieval ambition. They maintained sophisticated farms that produced dairy and wool. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats against impossible odds. They conducted extensive trade with the distant markets of Europe, somehow maintaining economic connections across one of the world's most treacherous oceans. They hunted, they survived. They created a functioning medieval society at the edge of the known world, complete with bishops, churches, social hierarchies, and all the trappings of European civilization. And then, sometime in the 15th century, they appeared to vanish completely. By the year 1500, there was barely a trace of Norse civilization left in Greenland. No active settlements, no trade ships arriving from Europe, no archaeological evidence of continued habitation. Ruins were left behind, churches were abandoned, farmsteads fell into decay. It was as if an entire European colony simply packed up and disappeared into the mist, leaving behind only mysteries and questions that would perplex scholars for centuries to come. This disappearance has captivated historians and archaeologists for generations. Did the population starve due to failed harvests or the loss of trade connections? Did they succumb to disease that swept through the isolated settlements? Did they abandon their homes in desperation and somehow sail back to Europe across the North Atlantic during increasingly dangerous climatic conditions? Did they gradually integrate with the indigenous Inuit populations, losing their European identity and being absorbed into Arctic cultures? Did they simply die off, their numbers declining until the settlements were no longer viable? Theories proliferated throughout academic circles, but solid, verifiable answers remained frustratingly elusive. Archaeological records were incomplete. Written documentation was sparse. The Norse seemed to have left behind only ruins and artifacts, along with a profound historical mystery that seemed impossible to solve. Now, however, cutting-edge DNA analysis is completely rewriting this entire narrative. Researchers working with ancient genetic material from medieval remains are revealing a story far stranger, far more sophisticated, and far more deeply connected to the world around them than anyone previously imagined. This new understanding challenges everything we thought we knew about who these Vikings were, what they were doing in Greenland, and what ultimately happened to them. In 2020, scientists conducted the largest genetic study of Viking remains ever undertaken in history. Researchers led by Professor Eske Willerslev from the University of Cambridge and the University of Copenhagen analyzed the complete genomes of over 442 Viking individuals. These remains came from more than 80 archaeological sites, scattered across an enormous geographic range, stretching from Italy and the Byzantine Empire to the far reaches of the North Atlantic. The samples included men, women, and children buried across different time periods spanning centuries, some with elaborate grave goods indicating high status, and others in simple graves suggesting ordinary people. What these researchers discovered fundamentally challenged and disrupted everything we thought we knew about Vikings and Viking society. The popular image of a Viking has remained remarkably consistent throughout modern culture. It depicts a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, muscular warrior of pure Scandinavian blood, sailing from the frozen north to pillage, raid, and conquer everything in his path. This image has dominated popular culture for generations, reinforced by Hollywood films, television shows, history books, and countless popular narratives. But the genetic evidence revealed through DNA analysis tells a radically different story. The truth is far messier, far more diverse, and considerably more interesting than the popular stereotype has ever suggested. The DNA analysis revealed that Vikings were an extraordinarily mixed and genetically diverse group. Many Vikings actually had brown hair rather than the blonde hair depicted in stereotypes. Some Vikings had dark complexions. Some had genetic markers indicating ancestry from populations far outside Scandinavia. Genetic analysis of famous Viking burial sites in Scotland revealed something even more shocking. Some of the individuals buried with full Viking ceremony and Viking grave goods were not genetically Scandinavian at all. They were local Scottish people who had adopted Viking culture, Viking practices, and Viking identities. Despite lacking Scandinavian ancestry, they had been buried as Vikings. suggesting that Viking identity was something that could be adopted, learned, and integrated into one's identity regardless of biological origin. Some high-status Viking burials contained the remains of individuals whose genetic lineages traced back to southern Europe, the Mediterranean world, and even the Middle East. Vikings served in the famous Varangian Guard in Constantinople, where they encountered Byzantine culture and the broader Mediterranean world. This mixing was not accidental or rare. It was a fundamental characteristic of Viking society. Viking identity was not about genetics, purity of blood, or Scandinavian ancestry. It was about culture, about shared practices, about adopting a way of life and becoming part of a society. Vikings were not an ethnic group in any meaningful biological sense. They were a cultural phenomenon, a way of organizing society and conducting commerce that could be adopted by people of diverse origins. The research also revealed something unexpected about the Scandinavian homeland itself. Before and during the Viking Age, Scandinavia experienced significant gene flow from populations to the south and east. Foreign genetic material from Asia and southern Europe had already mixed into Scandinavian populations centuries before Vikings set sail on their famous expeditions. The genetic history of Scandinavia was far more cosmopolitan and interconnected than previously thought. The Vikings themselves were already products of centuries of migration and mixing, carrying within their own genetic material the traces of ancient movements and contacts across Eurasia. Different regions of Scandinavia sent their explorers in distinctly different directions, shaped by geography and opportunity. Norwegians were most likely to sail west and north into the Atlantic, establishing settlements in Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, and eventually the distant island of Greenland. Danes were more likely to head south and west into England and France. Swedes primarily moved east, traveling down the great river systems of Russia and Ukraine, establishing trade networks that reached all the way to Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Each cultural group developed distinct patterns of expansion and settlement, determined partly by the geography of their homelands and partly by the opportunities they encountered. But Greenland represented something unique in the Viking world. It was the furthest outpost of Norse civilization, the most isolated, the most extreme, the most challenging. The Vikings who chose to settle there were not traders operating along established routes or raiders following proven patterns of conquest. They were colonists, farmers, hunters, explorers, and risk-takers, willing to endure extraordinary hardship and uncertainty for economic opportunity and the possibility of building something entirely new in a land that no European had attempted to colonize before. When researchers examined Norse Greenlander remains using DNA analysis, they discovered something revealing. The Greenland population was genetically distinct from Scandinavian ancestors, suggesting adaptation and mixing before migration to Greenland. There was clear evidence of mixing between Scandinavian men and women from the British Isles. Some of the women who came to Greenland were not from Scandinavia at all, but from Britain, suggesting that Viking settlement was already a process of cultural assimilation and genetic mixing, not the movement of pure populations to new territories. This brings us to what modern DNA analysis has revealed about Greenland Vikings specifically, a discovery that has fundamentally changed our understanding of what these people actually did with their lives. In 2024, scientists published a groundbreaking study in the journal Science Advances that completely revolutionized our understanding of Greenland Norse activities and capabilities. Using ancient DNA extracted from walrus skeletal remains, researchers were able to trace where these animals had originally lived by analyzing the genetic signatures present in their bones. By studying fragments of walrus skulls from Viking settlements scattered across Europe and Greenland, scientists created a detailed genetic map showing the geographic origins of Arctic walrus populations during the medieval Viking Age. Then they compared this map to walrus remains found in Viking settlements and trading posts, which revealed where the Norse must have hunted and obtained their most valuable commodity. The results were absolutely staggering and transformed our understanding of Norse capabilities and ambition. The Greenland Norse did not limit their hunting and economic activities to nearby waters close to their settlements. DNA evidence showed conclusively that they obtained walrus ivory from the high Arctic, particularly from an area called the North Waterpolynya, a vast region of open water at the northern edge of Greenland, where walrus populations gathered seasonally. Even more remarkably, some walrus remains suggested hunting. Expeditions that may have extended all the way into the Canadian Arctic, hundreds of miles north of Greenland proper, possibly reaching into the interior Arctic that most historians thought was completely inaccessible to medieval Europeans. These were voyages of extraordinary danger and difficulty, requiring advanced sailing skills, deep knowledge of Arctic conditions and navigation, and an almost reckless willingness to risk lives in pursuit of profit and exploration. Walrus ivory was not a luxury commodity that the Norse themselves used or valued for personal ornament. Instead, it was their primary cash crop, their economic lifeline, their path to wealth and survival in an otherwise marginal land. Walrus tusks could be carved into ornaments, religious objects, ecclesiastical decorations, and intricate decorative items that were in extraordinarily high demand across medieval Europe. The ivory trade was the economic engine that drove Greenland's entire existence. It was the reason why Eric the Red had established settlements there in the first place, why he had convinced others to join him in such a harsh land. It was what made Greenland valuable and interesting to European traders and merchants. It was the commodity that kept ships coming to the settlements, that kept the colonies connected to the wider world, that provided the economic foundation for survival. The peak of the walrus ivory trade corresponded exactly with the peak of Greenland's prosperity and population growth. During the 12th and 13th centuries, when Romanesque art style dominated Europe and drove extraordinary demand for decorative objects made from exotic materials, the demand for walrus ivory exploded. Greenland became wealthier and more densely populated than ever before. More settlements were established. More churches were built, including some of considerable architectural sophistication. More land was developed for farming and pasture. The entire economic system appeared sustainable, even thriving, based on the continuing demand for Arctic ivory across the European continent. But these Arctic hunting expeditions carried enormous inherent risks that are difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. To reach the North Water Polynya and the rich walrus grounds beyond, Norse hunters had to sail hundreds of miles into unknown waters, into conditions that were barely predictable or understandable with medieval technology. They had to navigate treacherous ice fields that could form and break apart with little warning. They had to manage unpredictable weather patterns and currents they barely understood. They had to maintain open water boats in an environment where a single mistake could mean death for an entire crew. Many of these hunting expeditions must have ended in disaster, lost ships and drowning crews, the bodies of Greenlanders scattered across Arctic waters. Yet the economic incentive was so powerful that the hunts continued year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The profit margin on walrus ivory was so extraordinary that it justified accepting even catastrophic losses, accepting that many hunters would never return, accepting the deaths of people in pursuit of wealth. And here is where the mystery deepens considerably. DNA evidence shows that the Norse were not hunting walrus in isolation or as the only people operating in the Arctic. They were meeting indigenous Arctic peoples on a regular basis. They were trading with a Thule culture, the ancestors of modern Inuit populations. They may have encountered the remnants of the Dorset people, another indigenous culture that had inhabited the Arctic for centuries before the Thule expansion moved northward. For generations, historians believe the Norse settlements of Greenland existed in almost complete isolation, separated from indigenous Arctic cultures by vast distances and mutual incomprehension, with little or no regular interaction. But the DNA evidence of walrus trade and hunting patterns suggests something far different. Sustained contact between cultures, active trading relationships, economic exchange, and a level of integration into the Arctic economy that had been almost completely invisible in the historical record. These interactions with indigenous peoples would have been absolutely essential for Norse survival and success. The Thule people possessed centuries of accumulated knowledge about hunting in Arctic conditions, understanding ice patterns and their changes, reading weather signs, locating game in vast and unfamiliar territories, and surviving in an environment that was utterly foreign to European settlers. They had perfected techniques and knowledge systems over generations that allowed humans to thrive in the Arctic. If the Norse Greenlanders were mounting hunting expeditions deep into the high Arctic, they would have needed guidance from people who actually knew those waters. They would have needed supplies and logistical support from indigenous peoples who already possessed the accumulated wisdom of Arctic living. They would have needed maps and directions and warnings about hazards. The walrus ivory trade was not a purely Norse enterprise conducted in isolation. It was a collaborative economy built on exchanges and partnerships between the Norse and the indigenous Arctic peoples, though this partnership was likely unequal and driven primarily by Norse economic interests. Yet here emerges the most astonishing and revealing fact uncovered by modern genetics. Despite centuries of contact and interaction, despite decades and decades of active trade, despite living in close geographic proximity and sharing Arctic resources, there is virtually no genetic evidence of the Norse mixing biologically with the Inuit. Modern Greenlanders are almost exclusively descended from Inuit ancestors. When researchers examined the genetic ancestry of contemporary Greenlanders, they found that the European genetic contribution comes almost entirely from Danish sources, not Norse sources, and that this mixing occurred within the last few hundred years, long after the Norse settlements had been abandoned. The genetic legacy of the medieval Norse Vikings in Greenland is virtually non-existent. There is no significant admixture between Norse and Inuit populations in the genetic record. No lasting genetic contribution from the Norse to modern Greenland's population. No biological lineage connecting medieval Norse settlers to the contemporary Greenlandic people. This genetic absence speaks volumes and reveals something profound about the nature of Norse society in Greenland. It suggests a society that was fundamentally separate and distinct, maintaining boundaries that were rigid and lasting, despite its deep economic dependence on Arctic resources and Arctic peoples. It suggests cultural boundaries that were remarkably strong and were actively maintained, even when the two societies were engaged in regular trading relationships and shared economic interests. It suggests that the Norse never truly integrated into Arctic society, never truly became part of the indigenous world, remained always outsiders, always separate, always maintaining their own distinct European identity and practices. They adapted their hunting techniques and their economic strategies to Arctic conditions, but they did not adapt their society or their culture in ways that would have led to mixing and integration with indigenous peoples. As the 14th century progressed, the global economic system that had sustained Greenland began to shift and change in ways beyond the settlers' control. The demand for walrus ivory in Europe began to decline. Fashions changed, artistic preferences shifted, and economic priorities evolved. Alternative sources of Arctic ivory appeared, including supplies from Svalbard and from Russia, which could be obtained more easily and with less risk than Greenland supplies. The commodity that had built Greenland's entire economy was becoming less valuable and less necessary. The profit margins that had justified the risky Arctic hunts were shrinking. The economic foundation of the settlements was crumbling. Around the same time, something equally troubling was happening with the climate. The medieval warm period that had made Greenland more habitable and more accessible was beginning to give way to what historians call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped across the North Atlantic. Growing seasons shortened significantly. The fjords that had been more easily navigable began to freeze over for longer periods. The pasture land that had supported livestock became less productive. Farming became more difficult and less reliable. Survival became harder, and the margins for error became smaller. The natural conditions that had made settlement possible were being withdrawn. The western settlement, located in the far northwest of Greenland, was abandoned first, sometime in the 14th century. Ships stopped coming from Europe to trade with the settlement. Trade routes became unreliable. The economic system that had sustained the settlement completely collapsed. Families would have faced impossible choices: remain in a settlement with no trade, no income, no connection to Europe, no access to goods that had become essential to their way of life, or attempt the dangerous voyage back across the North Atlantic with no guarantee of success. Some chose to leave. Some chose to remain. Over time, the settlement was gradually depopulated as people made individual decisions about whether to risk staying or attempt to escape. The eastern settlement, located in the far south and larger and better positioned than the western settlement, persisted longer, maintaining sporadic contacts with Europe into the 15th century. But it too eventually faced the same pressures: declining trade, changing climate, loss of economic viability. By the middle of the 15th century, even the eastern settlement appeared to have been abandoned. The last documented evidence of active Norse settlement was the wedding in 1408, when a young woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir married a man in Greenland in a ceremony recorded in the sagas. It was one of the last written references to active Norse society in Greenland. After that point, the documentary record goes completely silent. But abandoned may not be entirely the right word to describe what happened. The DNA evidence, combined with the archaeological record, suggests something considerably more complex than a sudden evacuation or disappearance. The Norse did not complete vanish in a single dramatic event. Some members of the population may have gradually integrated with the Inuit over time, eventually disappearing into the indigenous population through social assimilation. Some may have sailed back to Europe or to Iceland, attempting to escape the failing colony. Some may have died, their remains eventually buried in the ground or lost at sea. But the most striking interpretation suggested by the evidence is that the Norse settlements were not suddenly emptied by some catastrophic event. They were gradually depopulated as economic viability disappeared, and individual people and families made personal decisions about whether to stay or leave. The settlements contracted over decades, with populations declining slowly as trade failed and conditions worsened. Eventually, the populations dropped below the threshold needed to maintain organized communities. Churches fell silent. Farms were abandoned. The settlements became ruins. What the DNA evidence and archaeological record clearly show is that the end was not sudden or dramatic or catastrophic. The Greenland Norse did not vanish overnight or disappear completely into the Arctic. They disappeared gradually over decades and centuries as the economic system that had sustained them became unviable and conditions worsened. The mystery was never about what happened to the Greenland Vikings. The mystery was always about understanding how a European medieval society could establish itself so completely in the Arctic and maintain itself for 500 years, and what would cause it to gradually decline and disappear. The story of the Greenland Vikings is fundamentally a story about economics, about trade networks, about the relationship between distant markets and isolated settlements at the frontier of the known world. Walrus ivory was not merely a commodity. It was the entire economic foundation upon which Norse Greenland was built. Without the European demand for walrus ivory, without the profits generated by this trade, the settlements would never have been established in the first place. Without continuing demand and continuing profits, the settlements could not be sustained. The Norse Greenlanders were entrepreneurs and risk-takers who understood that they could profit from Arctic resources. They invested centuries of effort and sacrifice into developing the walrus trade. But they were ultimately vulnerable to forces beyond their control, changing fashions in Europe, competition from alternative ivory sources, the emergence of new trade routes and new economic opportunities. The role of indigenous Arctic peoples in this story has been profoundly misunderstood. The DNA evidence reveals that Norse hunting expeditions would have been impossible without indigenous knowledge and support. The Thule people possessed centuries of accumulated knowledge about Arctic survival. When the Norse began hunting for walrus ivory, they must have relied on help from indigenous hunters and guides. The walrus trade was an indigenous economy that the Norse tapped into, ultimately depending on indigenous expertise. Yet despite this economic interdependence, the genetic record shows virtually no biological mixing between populations, suggesting a remarkably rigid cultural boundary. The Norse valued Arctic resources and opportunities, but did not seek integration into Arctic society. They remained Europeans, maintaining distinct cultural practices and identities. They adapted their economic activities to the Arctic, but not their society. This limitation proved critical when conditions changed. The climate change from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age devastated Norse settlements built on thin margins. Farmland became less productive. Pastures became difficult to maintain. Sea voyages grew more dangerous. The window for sailing the North Atlantic narrowed. For a society dependent entirely on international trade, disruption of trade routes was catastrophic. For a society that had never fully adapted to Arctic conditions, the climate shift toward more Arctic conditions was equally devastating. What makes this story remarkable is that the Norse Greenlanders persisted for 500 years in one of the world's most hostile environments. They built churches that still stand today. They developed trade networks connecting Greenland to distant European markets. They hunted in the high Arctic and traded with indigenous peoples. That they ultimately could not sustain these settlements reflects economic forces and climate change beyond their control, not lack of determination or capability. Modern genetics reveals that Norse Greenlanders were not the pure-blooded Scandinavian colonists of popular imagination, but a diverse group including British people and various European backgrounds. They were deeply engaged in economic relationships with indigenous Arctic populations. They were explorers and traders taking enormous risks in pursuit of profit. They were adaptable economically, but rigid culturally. They ultimately could not sustain an economy based on a single commodity in a location profoundly marginal to European civilization. The question that the DNA evidence forces us to confront is what this story tells us about the limits of European expansion. The Vikings succeeded in establishing settlements across the North Atlantic, reaching Greenland and apparently even North America, as the sagas describes. Yet even they could not maintain permanent settlements at the Arctic's edge when economic conditions deteriorated and climate shifted. The Greenland Norse settlements ultimately failed because they depended entirely on demand for a single commodity and on oceanic trade routes vulnerable to climate disruption. What remains of the Greenland Vikings is not their genetic legacy in the modern Greenlandic population. What remains is the archaeological record, the ruins of their settlements, the fragments scattered across the Greenland landscape. What remains is their written records in the sagas and church documents. What remains is evidence embedded in ancient walrus remains and the DNA that reveals where they hunted. What remains is the knowledge that they were here, that they tried, and that they eventually had to accept defeat. The new DNA research reveals that the Greenland Viking story was far more complex and connected to the Arctic world than previously understood. The Norse were never truly isolated. They were always engaged with Arctic peoples and resources, dependent on Arctic ecology and economies, part of a larger trading network. They were a society in transition, gradually declining as economic conditions changed and climate shifted. The mystery of the Greenland Vikings was never about what happened to them, but about understanding what they were trying to accomplish and why they ultimately failed. Thanks to modern DNA analysis, we now understand the true complexity of their story. They were a diverse, economically sophisticated group of people trying to build something unprecedented in the Arctic. They were traders and hunters, engaged with indigenous peoples and Arctic economies. They were trying to survive and profit in an environment too harsh to sustain permanent European settlement. When the economic system supporting them collapsed and climate cooled, they gradually withdrew and abandoned their settlements, leaving only ruins and the story we are now beginning to understand.